Thank you, Brent, for the intro, and thank you, Pierre, for inviting us today. For those of you who don't know us, Brent said a little bit, but my name is Lina Wenner. I'm associate partner at First Minute Capital. We're a $100 million early stage fund based in London, but investing across Europe and the US, and backed by a group of exciting entrepreneurs, 30 unicorn founders, Atomico and Tencent, and also actually Andy, who I'm speaking to today, which we're really excited to have you. What is my first minute? So the concept of this webinar series that we're doing is very simple. We want to hear from leading CEOs and founders about some of their early days, their first minute, if you will, and what's on their mind at the moment, what they're excited about, what they're focusing on next. And hopefully from today's session, we'll also have a few important lessons for budding founders who will be listening today. So far, we've had a really stellar roster. We've had Tony Blair, Nico Rosberg, founders of Calm, Rent the Runway, Eventbrite, Skype, and many, many more. And now really excited to turn to today's guest, Andy Phillipps. Andy, you've had a really illustrious career, both as a founder of Active Hotels, which later became, you later became the CEO of Priceline's international business, which obviously became Booking Holdings, which is a multi-billion company today. You're a very prominent non-executive as well. You've also done a ton of angel investments, actually portfolio almost as big as ours, I think, at First Minute. But for today, I'd like to dive right in and start almost at the very beginning, at your very first entrepreneurial minute, if you will. Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about your slightly unconventional route to becoming a founder?
Cool. Thank you very much, Lina. And firstly, thank you so much for letting me be here. I think Founders of the Future is a fantastic program, and I'm delighted to be here. I was just going to quickly start with it. I got some feedback from INSEAD once when I spoke there, and it was from one of my students. And the feedback was Andy's involvement is inspirational, which I thought was fantastic. And it went on to say, if Andy can succeed, it makes you feel anyone can. So, which was not quite so inspirational. But anyway, answering your question, I was a geek by background, so I did a PhD originally in mixed mode interfacial fracture of biomimetic ceramic laminates, which was a bit of a conversational stopper at parties. And originally worked on that because I'm sure you're aware, if you can burn fuels at a higher temperature, you can reduce the amount of NOx that are produced. So it was a kind of very early stage environmental tech. So I kind of moved in from that into industrial research. I worked with lots of big corporations, massive 35,000 employees kind of thing in lots of different territories, normally in kind of clean tech in retrospect. It wasn't called clean tech back then, but I spent most of my time working for an exhaust gas management company that helped a lot of semiconductor manufacture generates an awful lot of pollutants, etc. And so I was working to try and reduce the amount of noxious gases going out into the environment from those guys. And I'd been working for them probably for 3 years, and as many people working for big companies, and I was pretty young at the time, I was quite arrogant. I was looking at it going, I'm sure that this business could be run better, and I was kind of pigeonholed as a techie, and so I was wheeled out in my lab coat to try and solve tech problems periodically, and then stuffed back in the basement after I'd spoken, and I was desperate to try and get some better knowledge of how business worked as a whole, which led me on to doing an MBA at INSEAD at some point.
And I guess when you have a PhD from Cambridge in a very technical subject, you have pretty high opportunity cost when you then start to, think about starting a business. Why did you go into travel? How confident were you that it was going to work out? It looks from the outside, it looks like a big risk that you took at the time.
Yeah, it felt quite a big risk. And rather depressingly, when I did a numerical PhD, and virtually everyone doing numerical PhDs got poached by hedge funds to go and become quants. And so, I went into research just because I was interested in technology there. And then running my own business afterwards felt really risky. I remember explaining I've got ridiculously supportive parents, and I remember explaining to my mother I was going to set up my own business. And she sort of, she looks at me and says, "That's nice, darling. It's so difficult to get a real job nowadays." And that made me feel even worse, that, I really am taking quite a big career risk. And it just wasn't that trendy, back when I first set up my business. So I knew I wanted to run something on my own. I wasn't quite sure I could do it. And so there was a lot of challenge motivated. Was I particularly passionate about hotels, etc.? Probably not. Actually, it was more of an academic exercise. I saw that was an area that you could potentially make money.
Mm-hmm. And you started the business with your cousin in 1998, 1999, I think it was, right? Was there other things that you were thinking about at the time? Like you say travel, it was an academic exercise, but I read somewhere you were looking to potentially start an olive business. So it could have been non-tech as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. A lot of the businesses I've been working with manufacturing. So I kind of understood manufacturing processes quite well. Which actually proved to be really useful later when I was working in hotel booking. But originally I was actually looking at buying an olive factory. I went around probably 10 or so in Lleida in Spain and in Barcelona, in Madrid. I went down to Morocco, and then we looked at buying one in Provence. Yeah, and we got right down to making the offer, whatever. And actually my co-founder rang me, and he's my cousin, so he was expected to be rude, and he was. And he was just saying, "This is ridiculous. You're in the midst of the biggest thing to hit business in 50 years with the internet, and you're buying an olive business." Yeah. And so he was saying, "Look, we need to set up something online."
Yeah, got it. And you didn't raise too much money actually with Active Hotels by today's standards. I think you raised about just under £4 million in total. Sort of in your first round, which I think was half a million pounds, was there any advice that you'd sort of give yourself now, looking back on it? What was it like raising money at that time?
I felt incredibly useless actually at it, because we were trying to raise money for quite a long time, and then we actually raised money in February 2000. And meanwhile, Brent, who I don't know if he's still lurking in the background, but I think Brent raised 60 million or something in parallel. So I was struggling to get my first 400,000, and Brent raised 60 million. So I was thinking, okay, maybe I'm not particularly good at this aspect of it. The advice I probably give myself looking back at it, if something could go wrong in my business, it did go wrong. I really was not a particularly competent founder when I set it up, and at the time I was slightly defensive about that. So I was trying to pretend to investors that I knew the answers to everything. And it was almost like being in a class where they're asking you a question, you go, I know the answer. And actually, as you get more confident, you realize you don't need to know all the answers. You need to go, yeah, that's a really interesting question. I'm thinking about it like this. What are your thoughts? And rather than trying to sell across the table to them, try and get them across to your side of the table and to show them that you want their advice, you want them to listen, etc. So being slightly less defensive on that. I also wish I'd raised a lot more money. Because raising £400,000, we could have raised a lot more, or not a lot, not by Brent standards, but we could have raised probably about $1 million at that point. And I was saying, I don't want to dilute. And we ended up raising a relatively small amount of money. And then the other really stupid thing that I got wrong is in my first funding pitch, someone said, what's the valuation? And I gave the number, and they said, is that pre or post money? And I didn't know the difference between pre and post money. So I said post, thinking 50% chance it might be right, and realized that I just reduced the value of my company.
Practical piece of advice you've got right there, I think. Really interesting. And I guess, we've got quite a young audience today, but you raised money in the middle of the .com crash. How did that impact you? And what was the atmosphere like in the company at that time?
I wouldn't have said it at the time, but in retrospect, it really, really, really helped. And it helped in two ways. Firstly, I'd poached loads of people from manufacturing backgrounds and big, heavy industrial manufacturing background. I'd worked in the steel industry and the ceramics industry and this kind of thing. And so I'd poached people who were firstly incredibly cheap. I was paying sort of £15,000 to £20,000 to get someone to leave from British Steel or whatever. Wow. So we had a really low cost base here, which obviously helps if the funding environment's getting tough. What we'd also raised in retrospect, it seemed that £400,000 at the time seemed a huge amount of money to me, but in retrospect, it was a tiny amount of money. And so meanwhile, we did a map when we first launched, and we had about 50 credible competitors who had raised millions. And as a result, they'd all put the cost base up to reflect the fact that they'd raised millions. And then when funding dried up, and it completely dried up, post 2000, it meant that we had a low cost base. We'd always focused on trying to be profitable, just because we didn't have very much money. And it meant that we were in a relatively strong operational position. And it didn't, at the time we're going, this is really difficult. We're really struggling, but in retrospect, everyone else was struggling more. And so it significantly helped.
With that experience in mind, do you today, and this is jumping forward a bit, but today when you're talking to founders who are looking to raise seed money, are you looking for that kind of focus on trying to get the unit economics right from the start, bringing them to profitability? Or are you quite happy to back someone who says, I'm going to continue to raise money for this business because that's the only way I'll get to scale, and other people are doing it too?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't have a definite answer to it. I invest quite a lot in marketplaces, and I always look quite hard at the unit economics, because the marketplaces always look profitable when you've got every single supplier and every single customer, and you're a natural monopoly, and everything looks fantastic. And so every single business plan, and you'll have seen it as well, it always goes flat, 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 and then hockey sticks up towards glory. Yeah, and sometimes it happens, but more often than not, it doesn't. And so I spend a lot of the time looking at unit economics anyway. There. So what I want by that, I mean, if you're going to sell one of these, is it conceivable you're going to make quite a lot of money from selling, or is it conceivable you'll have a decent gross margin from selling one? Mm-hmm. So I answer that question, and then I answer the next question: is it conceivable you can sell a lot? I think the scaling technique when you're in a cash strict or cash poor environment is different. So I'd probably want more visibility of the levers to growth. But then similarly, the risk of someone else just coming in, cash can cover up an awful lot of ills in a company. And if you're running a brilliant marketplace and someone else raises 100 million, it doesn't really matter. Your business is probably destroyed. So to some extent, it can make it more predictable in a cash trap environment. You're looking for really good operating businesses which have got a good visibility of the levers for growth, and the threat of someone else raising lots of money goes away slightly. So I'm actually normally quite optimistic about raising or setting up businesses in more difficult times. I think people have more inspiration when there are more constraints, and it becomes much, much clearer what you need to do when raising cash to bail you out each time isn't so easy.
Yeah, and I mean, some of the biggest tech companies came out of the financial crisis in 2008, so I think that definitely proves your point. But back to active hotels. So you grew very, very quickly, actually, despite only having raised a bit less than 4 million. And I think you grew almost tenfold by the time that you exited, which was a quick exit too. When Glenn Fogel, who it was at the time, I think, who's now CEO of Booking Holdings since 2017, he was then the M&A person at Priceline. When he approached you, was it sort of like a no-brainer for you to sell the company, or did you see a path to active hotels becoming what was now Booking? That makes sense. So and I think you've also said that it wasn't the highest bidding offer that you chose to go with in the end. So maybe help us understand that process and that situation a little bit more.
Yeah, it was a very strange time, as we were growing incredibly fast at the time. So I think we just won an award for growing 4,289%, and so it was the business itself was absolutely motoring, and around that time we had. In retrospect, it sounds very naive, but we had conversations with investment banks just saying, look, we're looking forward, what do we do? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we had all those conversations in confidence. And we went from being the people that no one had ever heard of just because we got on and operated and we never really raised money, to being approached by everyone. So every travel business in the world pretty much was reaching out saying, can we have a conversation? Can we have a conversation? So it wasn't just Glenn at the time. There were lots of people who were coming through. In retrospect, it was potentially naive from my point of view, but the dynamics of the travel industry mean that you typically make money in a couple of areas. Flights is a very hard area to make money in, although I know you've got Barry later who's done a fantastic job in that. But flights traditionally is a very hard place to make money. hotels is absolutely where people make money in the travel industry. And so when people come to you saying we're interested in buying your business or working with you, as they always put it, there's normally a threat at the end of it that if you don't work with us, then obviously we've got to win in hotels in Europe anyway. It's the biggest market, and we've got to do it. And so many founders go through this. There's a kind of greed and fear dynamic going on in parallel. The reason actually we ended up engaging with Glenn and then Jeff Boyd and Bob Myler at Priceline is we really liked them. It sounds a very soft reason, but they were straight, they were honest people who, very straightforward in how they dealt with us. They never threatened us in any way, shape or form, and they were just decent people. And so, I've been very lucky later, since that time as well, that I really value being able to work with people that I like and that I trust and whatever. And those people, oozed all the sort of human characteristics that you want in people you're going to work with. So much of the decision to work with Priceline was actually personal chemistry, and still is. I think Glenn is a fantastic individual.
I think that's really important. Also, how you then later take that learning and become, as an angel investor, I guess you're thinking the same way. Do I want to work with this person? When you exited to Priceline, or when that acquisition happened, you then also helped actually lead the acquisition of Booking.org, which later Priceline sort of adopted that name, and that obviously grew to become the majority of Booking Holdings' business. When you were CEO of that business, and that grew very, very quickly as well, Priceline's international business, what was it like doing the transition from being like an early stage founder to an executive of what became to be a really big company?
No, it's an interesting question, and it's very, very different. The purchase of Bookings.org was an interesting transaction, and it turned out to be incredibly lucrative for Priceline. Glenn, after we've been bought, he said, who else should we be looking at in Europe? And he hadn't actually come across Bookings at that point, I don't think. And we were saying, the only people we've ever lost a deal to in Europe are these guys. And we'd actually talked back in the day. The business model we had was incredibly unfashionable, and it wasn't what the analysts thought was going to work. And it was consumers liked it, but actually the analysts thought that this is not the future. And so we used to spend time at the back of conferences with Bookings at the time going, do you think this is right? This model that they're all proposing. So we knew Bookings reasonably well before we sold to Priceline. And I said, look, these are the only guys that I really worry about in Europe. We actually tried to merge with them before we sold to Priceline. And so it was fairly obvious that we should go and have a conversation with them. And broadly speaking, they were the only people I was worried about. And I think Steph would say we were the only people that he was worried about in Europe. So it made good sense to put us together. And actually, when we looked at the business, it was perfect synergies, that we had different strengths in different geographies. We had different demand routes that we were stronger in. And we had very good focus on the supply side, both of us. And we had the same fundamental model, which I can talk more about if you're interested in.
Yeah, I was just actually going to use that as a segue into what the magic was in your model and what allowed you to scale so quickly. For those who are too young to remember, what was the magic in the commission model? I understand you sort of flipped that on its head, and Bookings was doing something similar.
Yeah, I've heard people talk about what was good about Booking.com, and we were always worried that actually it wasn't that complicated, and that someone else could copy it. And it turned out that it is actually quite difficult to copy. So if I'm asked about it, there was definitely the component of it that we were commissioned rather than net rate. And so what that means for people who don't know the industry is that there are two ways of selling hotels typically. The hotel will either say, I want $100, I don't care what you sell it for. Head off, sell it for 120, 130, 200, whatever you want. I want 100. Yeah, and the seller will take all the money. So they have to take the money up front to the consumer, and then they pass on $100 to the hotel. And then the alternative model, which is the one we operated with, was the hotel set the price. We took a commission, and that commission might vary a bit. And the hotel will collect the money, and we'd invoice them in arrears. Yeah, and there are lots of things not to like about that as a startup. The cash would look like it's not so attractive. But the big thing for us is because we didn't come from the hotel industry, we didn't know what was trendy and whatever. All we did was we went to speak to, I think we spoke to 760 hotels before we launched. And we talked to several hundred consumers. And none of them said, look, I want net rate booking. They all said, I want the cheapest booking that I can possibly get. The hotels positively said, we don't want to sell net rate. We don't want someone else taking our cash and invoicing them. And so the analysts all told us it was a good thing to do. But actually, when you talk to the two customers, and you have two sides of customers on the marketplace, hotels and consumers, neither of them wanted it. Yeah, so that was a big change. The other thing that I would argue from booking side we were pretty good at is that we absolutely aligned supply with demand. Mm-hmm. So we were very good at making sure that the hotels knew if they didn't have good availability on the property, and there'd be alerts coming up on their metrics. We made sure they knew that when their price wasn't competitive, so they could adjust the price here. And as a result, we converted really well. If a consumer got to our website, we convert twice as well as our nearest competitor. And that means you can market more effectively. You've got more money to go with. And then the sort of third point on that was probably intermediaries are always hated in marketplaces. They're regarded as kind of parasite who takes money away from the ecosystem. And I'm not saying that booking is liked here, but hotels did view it as they are competing with the other hotel, because the hotel would decide if we want to market more aggressively, we can put, we can change our price, we can give better availability, or we can pay slightly more commission and we go up to the up the ranking somewhat. Yeah, and as a result, hotels competed with each other rather than necessarily arguing with us, and it made it a much more dynamic marketplace, and it made it convert much better.
And ultimately, you ended up merging under the Priceline umbrella. You ended up merging with who was then your competitor in Europe, Booking.org, and that turned out to be quite like a complicated. I guess mergers are always messy in a way. But what was that like to bring those companies together under one roof?
I've got huge respect now for, I know Brent has done many mergers, and lots of other people I know have done it. And this, I think, was a really easy one. We had perfect synergies. You couldn't have designed it better. And it was still pretty hard, just making sure that the new communications work and everyone has clear job descriptions and it all coordinates, etc. And it's just a very hard thing to make work. And I spent a lot of time focusing on what I thought the core strengths that we had were of the business, making sure they were protected. Comms, everyone tells you, and it's right, that you have to communicate. You always think as chief exec, you told everyone what's going on, and then you realize you speak to them tomorrow and they've forgotten it, or they didn't hear, or whatever. So you have to say it many, many times. Yeah, and then you have to regularly reevaluate what's working and what's not, because you don't want to lose the magic of what's already working. So to put it in context, bookings was growing at triple-figure growth rates. We were growing at triple-figure growth rates. So when you merge the two companies, the danger is that you might destroy both. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we spent quite a lot of time trying to make sure that didn't happen.
Yeah, and I guess that lesson of over-communicating is true for a startup founder just as much, actually. Any other operational lessons that you took from your time as an executive, but also previously your time as a founder of Active Hotels before you went into sort of the more the non-exec roles that you took on later on?
Yeah, sure. A lot of these things will sound really obvious, but they just weren't obvious to me. So you'll probably get different advice from every founder that you speak to on this thing. The ones for me that were really, really dramatic was I didn't realize quite how easily communicated the mood of the senior team is around the organization. So if you come in as a chief exec and you're not enthusiastic, you are not positive, it affects the organization. So I had to spend quite a lot of time making sure I'd have my cup of coffee before I got into the office to make sure that I was upbeat and etc. The counter to that, or the positive as that, is how far enthusiasm and belief will take you. I remember having massive imposter syndrome when we had to go to the boardroom of a very large multinational, and we didn't yet have an office, we didn't yet have any customers or whatever. And I remember standing there in my smartest suit saying, "We are going to be the largest hotel booking company in the world." And they kind of nodded and they looked at me, and you're looking, you can almost look at yourself from the corner of the room going, "They can't believe this, can they?" And that enthusiasm and self-belief is remarkably powerful. And I try and work with founders where I see that. Yeah, and then there's lots of operational stuff. So, we've already touched on unit economics and levers for growth, etc. One area I stressed more about than I did at the time was cash. We ran out of cash, multiple times. We were supposed to close money on September the 12th, 2001, right the day after September the 11th. And so we had a lot of stressful times with cash. And the one area that enthusiasm doesn't make any difference is cash. The bank manager just doesn't care that you're enthusiastic. They just want to know there's a balance in there. So.
Yeah. So selling the dream and looking after your cash, I take away as two important lessons. I think maybe turning now and just giving everyone a heads up that we'll have some time for questions at the end. So if you write your questions in the chat, then I'll be sure to ask Andy at the end. But maybe now turning a little bit towards the time when you left Priceline in 2006, and you really transitioned more into like a non-exec. You became chair of Top Table, which later sold to Open Table, as I understand. You also were non-exec at Trainline. So what shift was required for you mentally to move from an operator role into something that looks probably more like a coach when you're an investor or you're non-exec on a board?
Yeah, it's a really big transition, and I didn't realize how big it was until I was doing it. So the difficulty with being chief exec for 7-8 years, whatever it was, and I'm sure it's obvious. The decision lies with you. You have to make the decision, and particularly in booking, we spent a lot of time making sure that we acted at pace. There was a real urgency there, and so we made lots and lots of wrong decisions, but we made them quite fast, and we also reversed them if we'd made them wrong. Mm-hmm. And then you move into a non-exec role, and you feel, or at least I felt at the time, right, I've heard the information, right, I make the decision, and I get on with it. And that's not your role anymore. You're not there to make the decision. You're there to advise the founder. You're there to coach them. You're there to help them make the decision. And so I found that's, I think both sides. I think the chief execs I work with, and probably me as well, I was there going, come on, we need to make this decision, we need to move on. And realizing that if I carried on doing that, I would either step into an executive role or I'd annoy the chief exec so much I'd be stepped out. Mm-hmm. So it took me a while to switch across and realize that actually I'm there to give advice. They're there to take it or ignore it, and you have to accept as a non-exec that your advice is rightly ignored at some point because you don't have access to the information or the internal politics, whatever it is that the chief exec does. So it's a big switch, and I know many founders struggle with it.
And you must see lots of different styles of VCs as well in the boards that you join, etc., and how much they're on the executive side versus on the I'm going to give you advice, but ultimately you as a founder make the decision, which I think is interesting. Also from our perspective as a seed fund to think about for sure what the right tone is in those meetings, absolutely. And when did you start angel investing? What was your sort of your foray into angel investing? How did you think it was a good idea?
As with many angels, I think the original decision is almost payback. Actually, it's not really if you're going to make lots of money from angel investing, it's a very stressful way to do it. Mm-hmm. Here because for whatever reason, many of the businesses you think are fantastic will have unforeseen circumstances that mean they don't work or they do work or whatever, but it's hard to predict here. And so most angels that I speak with or work with now there's a large chunk of altruism that actually people helped us get going and it's time to give back. That makes it sound, I'm not giving money, I'm buying shares. So I'm not as nice as that sounds. But I'm certainly working with people that I want to do well, I want to help. And there's an element of almost duty in that. I feel it's needed for the ecosystem, and hopefully I can help that ecosystem a bit. And then the other great thing about being a founder, particularly when it works, is you get quite a lot of deal flow through anyway. People ring you saying, could you help in this instance? And so it's a way of vicariously carrying on being a founder whilst avoiding having to work late on Saturday nights for presentations on Mondays.
Sounds like a good life, yeah. When you started angel investing, well, let me ask the question a different way. Since you've started angel investing, what do you think you've become better at, in be it picking the companies that you work with or the way that you work with the founders? Like, what are some of the learnings that you've had personally as an angel investor throughout the last decade and a bit?
Yeah, I've made lots of cliched mistakes, both in business and in angel investing. Here, the classic one is I'll be looking at the business and going, that's a fantastic opportunity. That's absolutely brilliant. And I imagine what I would be doing to make it work. And you have to accept that you are not running the business. You're not just assessing the business opportunity, you're assessing the team's ability to execute against that. So I spend a lot more time now trying to work out whether the people in front of me have the skill sets, have the ambition, have the talents to make this work. And it's a cliche. Every VC says we invest in people, and the opposite sounds absurd. We would invest in a crap team. Of course you won't. But trying to work out what that actually means, what you're looking for in the people here. And for me, it's clock speed, it's likability. Actually, I don't want to work with people I don't like. It's flexibility, it's trust. I really want to believe that I can work with this person. I'm not going to always have to be watching my back, or they think I'm going to be stabbing them, etc. So I want a real partnership in that relationship. And then there's a lot of the other stuff we've already talked about gross margins and levers for scale and that kind of side of things. But it's the people that I've got a bit better, I hope, at working out whether they're right for the opportunity ahead of them.
And I'd love to dig on the likability point that you mentioned, because you could argue that a lot of maybe not so nice people end up being very, very successful. Is that for you a box that you want to tick because it's just nicer for you to work with them, or do you genuinely believe that likability is it can be an edge in when you're a founder?
Yeah, and maybe I should qualify it a bit. I don't want sort of soft, fluffy, nice people there. I definitely want a chief exec that I think can execute against it. And I guess maybe better than describing them as likable. Yeah, I want to believe that if this chief exec is successful, then the world will be a better place at the end of it. And I'm an angel investor, so I can make those sort of more subjective decisions. So I want to believe that if this person and their business works, then it's a good thing for the UK, Europe, the world that they've come into existence. And it's not saying, as you said, there are a large number of founders who maybe not fit into that category here, and good luck to them, etc. It's just I don't want to spend my time particularly working with them.
No, I that resonates very much with the way I think about it too. Talking a little bit about maybe what you think sort of a good academic path into founding a business is, because you obviously have that very deep technical degree. Is that something that when you evaluate an investment is something you look for, that technical expertise? And would you say that for the people on the call today, it's a very good idea to build your skill set in a very, sort of in a very technical way before founding a business?
There are obviously great businesses that do not involve tech. So it's absolutely not a necessity to to be tech to run a great business. Many of the opportunities I get most excited about are related to deep tech now, or at least some level of technology. And I think one of the big changes, I'm getting on a bit now, but when I first started here, it was, as we touched on earlier, it was quite common for people from technology backgrounds not to maintain that here. And I think the opportunity for people to have really world-changing impact here, and there are a lot of challenges out there at the moment that need addressing, which I know many of the pictures we're seeing later are related to climate change and some social issues here, but there are lots of things that need solving, and I think technology doesn't always, but can play a really significant role in addressing some of those things. So I think the opportunity to have global impact is easier with tech. That said, you can execute really effective businesses without technology, in food and various other things, but it tends to be an area I don't get so involved in.
When you look at your portfolio of 50-ish companies, what proportion of those would you say falls into the purpose-driven social impact category? And do you think that's going to increase over time? Do you think you're going to spend more time looking for founders that are trying to solve really big problems?
Yeah, I tend to work with founders now, or I tend to want to know that the problem the founder is addressing is really compelling and has a significant impact, which is another way of saying I think this business can have can make a very big business looking forward. So that tends to highlight a certain number of areas. And as you've alluded to, many of the challenges that I would see ahead now related to climate change, impact on society of tech, all those kind of things. And I'm keen to work in those kind of areas. Yeah, and I'm really not trying to be rude about people who do other stuff in other areas. It's just that's what works for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And when you look, you've had quite a long time angel investing already. When you look at some of the things that haven't worked out, is there a good way for you to codify, like, what was the thing that you missed at the time? Or would you say that because it's such a risky game, building a company today anyway, it would have been impossible to predict?
One of the things I've always noticed when things go wrong is it's always due to external factors. So it's always due to this, and this, and then when things go well, it's always, well, I did really well, didn't I? And so that would be the flippant answer to that. There are so many. Building large international businesses is just hard, and there are lots and lots of things that can go wrong. One of the things I try to get across when I'm working with founders here is that that a lot of them are terrified about things going wrong, and making people realize that it might not work out. It's not catastrophic for your career or for the world in many instances if it doesn't work. So try and maintain a sense of perspective on these things. And I've had founders who've had accidents here. I've had massive legal cases spring up out of nowhere against companies. You've had data hacks. I've had investors getting into physical fights, etc. It's there's just all kinds of peculiar things that go wrong in businesses, and it's just trying to maintain a level head and go, okay, actually, what's really important here? And that's something I still try to spend a lot of my time making sure I've got a better perspective, and also working with founders to help maintain their perspective. And it's very easy to get it out of perspective when you've recruited lots of people. You feel the pressure massively. It's hard to back out. Actually, in my case, it's a hotel booking business. If it doesn't work, the world still carries on going round. It's hotel booking.
I think that's always a good way to keep calm, and stuff. You're not saving any lives, but yeah, I think we talked a little bit about work-life balance yesterday as well, and sort of prioritize family at different points in your. And that's a rabbit hole we could go down on another time, maybe. But I've got one question here, maybe for the last couple of minutes, that was posed by the audience, and I'm just going to read it out. It's from Stephen Griffith, and he's wondering, as an acquired business, how did you integrate with the core platform capabilities of the mothership, be it tech, culture, etc.? So we touched upon it a little bit, but
yeah, sure. It's a great question. Actually, we were very lucky that, and one of the reasons actually we worked with Priceline is Priceline had tried to expand into Europe quite aggressively, and it hadn't worked. And so it meant that there was kind of mutual respect on both sides when we were discussing that. Jeff in particular was saying that we acknowledge we've tried to expand in Europe. It hasn't really happened. So we need to step back and listen to you. That's why we're buying you here. So they gave us an awful lot of autonomy. As was pointed out by the question, one of the areas that's hard to have complete autonomy there is on the tech side. So there's some Sarbanes-Oxley requirements, etc. So that was probably the biggest area. We did maintain our own platform there, but there was a lot of intervention just to make sure that we were compliant with all the US regulations, etc. that we had to be. But it's a great question, and I can give that answer, but I wish I had a better one.
I think it was a very good answer, and I thought the conversation was super, super interesting. So thank you so much, Andy, for your time. I think we have to wrap up, but really, really appreciate having you on today, and so many important lessons from a very illustrious career. So thank you.
No, fantastic. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Andy. I'm just going to quickly announce the next session. Everyone who's still on, make sure to tune in for the next session of the Founders of the Future Forum, which is the F Factor 19 to 25 national final, which will start in about 10 minutes, so at 2:05. Thank you, everyone.